The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after dawn, and Harrison Kane knew before he could make out the shape that trouble or opportunity was heading straight for his ranch. He stood on the porch of his modest but sturdy home, coffee cup in hand, watching as the rider approached with a determination that suggested neither would be turned away easily. The Montana Territory stretched endless in every direction from his property, a sea of golden grass and distant mountains that had been his whole world for the better part of 30 years. And in all that time, he had learned to read the land and the people who crossed it with the precision of a man whose survival depended on such knowledge. The rider drew closer, and Harrison felt his assumptions crumble like dried creek bed clay. It was not a man at all, but a woman, and she sat her horse with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of determination masking inexperience. Her dark riding clothes were practical but clearly expensive, the kind of outfit someone from back east might purchase, before heading into what they imagined the frontier to be. As she reined in her mount before his porch, Harrison set down his coffee and descended the 3 wooden steps to meet her, noting the way her hands gripped the reins just a touch too tight and the slight tremor in her shoulders that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. "Good morning, miss," Harrison said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "You are a long way from Georgetown this early. Can I help you with something?" The woman dismounted with careful precision, clearly not trusting her own abilities, and when she turned to face him fully, Harrison felt something shift in his chest like a lodgepole pine settling into new soil. She was perhaps 25 years old, with honey-colored hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes the color of creek water in summer, clear and startling in their directness. Dust coated her clothes and face, evidence of a long ride, but beneath the grime was a beauty that seemed entirely unaware of itself. "My name is Penelope Morrison," she said, and her voice carried the cultured tones of education and privilege even as it shook slightly with nerves or exhaustion. "I was told in town that you might have horses for sale. Good horses. I need one, and I was told you would deal fairly." Harrison studied her for a long moment, taking in the expensive boots now scuffed with trail dust, the determined set of her jaw, and the shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "I have horses," he said carefully, "but Georgetown is not exactly on the way to anywhere." "What brings you to Montana Territory, Miss Morrison, if you do not mind my asking?" Something flickered in her expression, a vulnerability quickly masked. "I am starting over," she said simply. "I have purchased a small property about 10 miles west of Georgetown. The previous owner left some cattle, a few chickens, but no horses. I need at least one good mount, something reliable, I can pay fairly." The sun was climbing higher now, promising another hot July day in 1883, and Harrison gestured toward his barn. "Come on, then. Let me show you what I have. But first, you look like you could use some water and maybe breakfast. Have you eaten?" Penelope hesitated, and in that hesitation Harrison read pride warring with necessity. "I ate before I left town," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "That was hours ago by the look of your horse," Harrison observed, noting the lather on the animal's flanks. "I was just about to make breakfast anyway. No sense looking at horses on an empty stomach, and your mount needs rest and water before you ride back." He did not wait for her to argue, instead taking the reins of her horse and leading it toward the water trough near the barn. Penelope followed, and Harrison was aware of her watching him with a wariness that suggested she had learned not to trust easily. He understood that. The frontier had a way of teaching such lessons to everyone, but especially to women trying to make their way alone. Inside the barn, Harrison unsaddled her horse with quick, efficient movements while Penelope stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light. "You have a fine setup here," she said, and there was genuine appreciation in her voice as she took in the clean stalls, the well-maintained tack, the overall sense of order and care. "How long have you been ranching?" "This land has been mine for 12 years," Harrison replied, hefting her saddle onto a rail. "Before that, I worked for other ranchers, learning the trade, saving my money. This is not a large operation, but it is mine, every acre and every animal on it." He led her back outside and toward the house, aware of her slight limp as she climbed the porch steps. "You are hurt," he observed. "Just sore from riding," Penelope said quickly. "I am not as experienced as I would like to be. Back in Philadelphia, I rode occasionally in parks, but this is rather different. Philadelphia." That explained the cultured accent, the expensive clothes, the air of refinement that clung to her despite the dust. Harrison pushed open the door to his home and gestured for her to enter, suddenly aware of the Spartan nature of his living space. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all at once, furnished with handmade furniture and decorated with nothing but the practical necessities of daily life. A few books lined a shelf near the window, and a faded photograph of his parents sat on the mantel above the fireplace. But otherwise, the space was devoid of the personal touches that might make it a home rather than simply a place to sleep and eat. "Sit," Harrison said, pointing to the sturdy table near the kitchen area. "Coffee first, then food." Penelope sank into the chair with a small sigh of relief that she tried to hide, but Harrison caught it anyway. He poured her coffee from the pot he had made earlier, then set about preparing breakfast with the efficient movements of a man long accustomed to caring for himself. Eggs from his chickens, bacon from his smokehouse, bread he had baked 2 days prior, and fresh butter from town. It was simple food, but honest, and he served it to her with a quiet pride in knowing that nearly everything on the plate had come from his own labor. "Thank you," Penelope said softly, and when she took the first bite, Harrison saw the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, and Harrison found himself studying her with a curiosity he had not felt in years. Women were rare in this part of Montana territory, and single women trying to run their own properties were even rarer. Whatever had brought Penelope Morrison west, it must have been something powerful indeed to make her leave the comforts of Philadelphia for the harsh realities of frontier life. "Why Montana?" Harrison asked finally, pushing his empty plate aside and cradling his coffee cup between his weathered hands. "If you do not mind me asking, there are plenty of places back east where a woman could start over without quite so much difficulty." Penelope looked up from her plate, and for a moment Harrison thought she would deflect the question. Then something seemed to shift in her, a decision made, and she set down her fork with careful precision. "My father died 6 months ago," she said quietly. "He left his estate to my brother, as is customary. My brother is not a bad man, but his wife and I did not see eye to eye on my place in their household. I had a small inheritance from my mother, enough to purchase property out here and start fresh. I wanted to build something of my own, something that could not be taken away or dictated by someone else's wishes." The pain in her voice was raw and real, and Harrison felt a surge of respect for this woman who had chosen independence over security. "That takes courage," he said. "This land does not forgive mistakes easily." "So I am learning," Penelope replied with a rueful smile. "The property I purchased sight unseen is in worse condition than the solicitor led me to believe. The house needs significant repairs, the fences are mostly down, and the previous owner apparently left in a hurry, taking anything of value. But the land is good, or so I am told, and the water rights are solid. I can make it work if I am willing to put in the effort." Harrison nodded slowly, recognizing the stubborn determination in her voice. He had heard it in his own voice years ago when he had first claimed this land, when everyone had told him he was a fool to try ranching on his own. "You will need more than one horse," he said. "If you are working cattle and maintaining a property that size, you will need at least 2, maybe 3 good mounts." "I can only afford one right now," Penelope admitted, and Harrison heard the frustration in her words. "But I will make do until I can save for another." They finished breakfast, and Harrison led her out to the corral where he kept his horses. He had 24 animals in various stages of training, from young colts still learning the basics to seasoned ranch horses that could anticipate a rider's needs almost before the rider knew them. Penelope walked along the fence line, studying each horse with an intensity that suggested she understood this was a decision that would affect every aspect of her new life. "That one," she said finally, pointing to a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. "What can you tell me about him?" Harrison smiled slightly. She had good instincts. "His name is Scout. 6 years old, well-trained, steady temperament. He will not spook easily, and he has enough endurance to work all day if you need him to. He is one of the best horses I have." "How much?" Penelope asked, turning to face him directly. Harrison named a price that was fair but not cheap, and he saw Penelope's face fall slightly. "That is more than I had hoped to spend," she admitted. "But if he is as good as you say, I can manage it, though it will take most of what I have left." Something in Harrison's chest tightened at the thought of this brave, determined woman spending her last dollars on a horse, leaving herself vulnerable to any number of disasters that could befall a new rancher. He made a decision that surprised himself. "Tell you what," he said slowly. "You can have Scout for half that price, with one condition." Penelope's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What condition?" "That you let me come by your property in the next few days and assess what repairs are most urgent," Harrison said, "and that you accept my help with those repairs. I have been ranching in this territory long enough to know what works and what does not, and I would hate to see you waste time and resources on the wrong things. Consider it a neighborly gesture." He watched the internal battle play out on her face. Pride warred with practicality, independence with need. Finally, practicality won. "Why would you do that?" she asked quietly. "You do not know me." "No," Harrison agreed, "but I know what it is like to start with nothing but determination and hope. And I know that out here, neighbors help each other because none of us can survive completely alone." Penelope studied him for a long moment, and Harrison had the distinct sense of being evaluated and measured. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "All right. Thank you, Mr. Kane. I accept your offer both for the horse and the help." "Harrison," he said, "if we are going to be neighbors and I am going to be helping with repairs, you might as well call me Harrison." "Harrison, then," Penelope repeated, and the smallest hint of a smile touched her lips. "And you should call me Penelope." They shook hands on the deal, and Harrison was struck by the firmness of her grip despite the softness of her hands. These were not the hands of someone accustomed to hard labor. Not yet, but he suspected that would change quickly. He spent the next hour showing Penelope how to saddle Scout properly, how to check the fit of the bridle, and demonstrating the verbal commands the horse responded to best. She listened with focused attention, asking intelligent questions and practicing each skill until she could perform it competently if not expertly. "You are a good teacher," Penelope said as she finished saddling Scout for the 3rd time under Harrison's watchful eye. "Patient." "You are a good student," Harrison replied. "Willing to learn. That is more important than natural talent out here." The sun was high overhead by the time Penelope prepared to ride back to Georgetown. Harrison loaded her saddlebags with supplies she had not asked for but clearly needed: coffee, flour, salt pork, a few tins of vegetables, and a small medical kit. When she started to protest, he held up a hand. "Consider it part of the deal," he said firmly. "You cannot work if you are not eating properly, and I have plenty to spare." Penelope's eyes were suspiciously bright as she mounted Scout, settling into the saddle with growing confidence. "I do not know how to thank you properly," she said. "Your kindness today has been unexpected." "Come back if you need anything," Harrison said, and he meant it. "And expect me to visit your property in the next day or two. I want to see what we are working with." He watched her ride away, sitting straighter and more confident on Scout than she had on her rented horse that morning. The dust cloud she raised grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, and still Harrison stood on his porch, staring at the empty horizon with a strange feeling settling in his chest. It had been a long time since he had felt anything beyond the simple satisfactions of hard work and solitude, but something about Penelope Morrison had awakened a longing he had thought long buried. The next morning, Harrison rose before dawn as was his habit, completed his necessary chores, and saddled his own horse, a powerful roan stallion named Thunder. He loaded a pack horse with tools and supplies, then set out in the direction of Georgetown, following Penelope's directions to her property. The ride took him through familiar country, past the Williams Ranch and the old trading post that had been abandoned for years, until he reached a turnoff that led through a narrow valley toward a cluster of cottonwood trees that marked the presence of water. Penelope's property, when he reached it, was both better and worse than he had imagined. The land itself was good, as she had said, with a decent creek running through it and enough grazing land to support a small herd. The house, however, was a disaster. It was a simple structure, probably built 20 years earlier, with walls that had weathered poorly and a roof that sagged ominously in the middle. The barn was in slightly better condition, and he could see evidence that Penelope had already been working, attempting to patch holes and shore up weak posts with limited success. She emerged from the house as he rode up, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon and her clothes already dusty despite the early hour. "You came," she said, and there was relief in her voice. "I said I would," Harrison replied, dismounting and tying Thunder to the porch rail. "Let me look around and see what we are dealing with." He spent the next 2 hours making a thorough inspection of the property, taking notes mentally and occasionally writing things down in a small notebook he carried. The house needed a new roof urgently before the fall rains came. Several floorboards were rotten and would need replacing. The windows needed fresh putty, and one pane of glass was cracked. The barn was structurally sound but needed reinforcement in places, and all the fencing needed to be rebuilt or at least substantially repaired. "It is a lot of work," Harrison said finally, sitting across from Penelope at the crude table inside her house. "But it is not insurmountable. The bones of the place are good. We can make it livable and functional." Penelope asked quietly. "I told you I would help," Harrison said. "I meant it. But I cannot do it alone if we are going to get it done before winter. You will have to work alongside me, and it will not be easy." "I am not afraid of hard work," Penelope said, lifting her chin. "Tell me what to do and I will do it." Over the next 3 weeks, Harrison found himself at Penelope's property more often than his own, arriving each morning with supplies and tools, working until the sun set, then riding home in the darkness. They started with the roof, which was the most urgent need, and Harrison taught Penelope how to split shingles, how to nail them in overlapping rows, how to seal the joints with pitch. She learned quickly. though her hands blistered and her muscles ached from unaccustomed labor. They worked mostly in silence at first, the kind of companionable quiet that comes from shared purpose. But gradually, as the days passed, they began to talk. Penelope told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, about her father who had encouraged her education despite society's disapproval, about her mother who had died when Penelope was 12, and left her feeling unmoored in a household of men who did not quite know what to do with an intelligent daughter. She spoke of her brother with love but also frustration, of his wife who had made it clear that Penelope's presence was tolerated but not welcomed. Harrison, in turn, found himself sharing stories he had not spoken aloud in years. He told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about parents who had died of fever when he was 17, about the years he had spent drifting west, working whatever jobs he could find, learning the skills that would eventually allow him to claim his own land. He spoke of the loneliness that had become so familiar he barely noticed it anymore, and of the satisfaction he found in building something lasting from raw materials and determination. On a particularly hot afternoon in early August, they were working on replacing rotten floorboards in the house when Penelope suddenly sat back on her heels and looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. "And please do not tell me it is just being neighborly. You have spent weeks here, neglecting your own work. There must be a reason." Harrison set down his hammer and met her gaze directly. He had been asking himself the same question, and the answer had become increasingly clear, even as it terrified him. "Because I have not felt this alive in years," he said honestly. "Because when I am here, working beside you, I remember what it feels like to be building something with someone rather than always being alone. And because somewhere along the way, I started to care about whether you succeed or fail, and I realized I wanted to see you succeed more than almost anything." The silence that followed his words was heavy with unspoken things. Penelope's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her blistered hands. "I have grown to depend on your presence," she admitted quietly. "I look forward to seeing you ride up each morning. I find myself wanting to share every small success with you, every challenge. I tell myself it is because you are helping me, because you are teaching me, but I think it is more than that." Harrison's heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "Penelope," he started, then stopped, unsure how to put into words the feelings that had been growing steadily stronger with each passing day. "I am not a man of fancy words or grand gestures. I am just a rancher who has spent most of his adult life alone by choice. But you have changed something in me. When I think about the future now, I find myself hoping you are part of it." Penelope looked up, and her eyes were bright with emotion. "I came west to be independent," she said softly, "to prove I could build a life on my own terms. But I am learning that independence does not have to mean isolation, that accepting help, accepting connection, is not the same as surrendering autonomy." Harrison reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and took her hand in his. Her fingers were calloused now from weeks of hard work, and he found that infinitely more beautiful than any soft, pampered hand could ever be. "I would never ask you to give up what you are building here," he said, "but I would like to be part of it, if you would have me. Not to take over, not to control, but to share the work and the rewards with you." "Yes," Penelope breathed. And then she was leaning forward and Harrison was meeting her halfway, and their lips touched in a kiss that was tentative at first, then deepening with all the longing and need that had been building between them for weeks. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, and Harrison felt as though something fundamental had shifted in his world, like the moment when ice breaks on a river in spring and everything begins flowing again. They sat there on the half-finished floor, hands clasped, foreheads touching, not speaking because words seemed inadequate to the moment. Outside, the Montana sun beat down relentlessly, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried its hunting call. But inside that small house with its patched roof and new floorboards, Harrison felt a peace he had never known before. The work continued, but now it had a different quality, a shared joy that transformed even the most tedious tasks into something precious. They rebuilt the fences together, driving posts deep into the Montana soil and stringing wire between them with careful precision. Harrison taught Penelope how to read the land, how to identify the best grazing areas, how to predict weather patterns from the behavior of animals and the formation of clouds. She proved to be an apt student, absorbing knowledge with the same focused intensity she had brought to learning how to roof a house. In the evenings, they would sit on her porch, exhausted but content, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Harrison brought his guitar one night, a battered instrument he had owned since his youth, and played simple songs while Penelope sang along in a clear, sweet voice that made something ache in his chest. They talked about their dreams, about the kind of life they wanted to build, about children and family, and the legacy they might leave behind. "I want at least 3 children," Penelope said one evening, her head resting on Harrison's shoulder as they watched stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Enough so that none of them are ever lonely, so they always have siblings to rely on." 3 is a good number, Harrison agreed, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Though I would be happy with as many as we are blessed with. I always regretted being an only child, especially after my parents died." "We will fill this house with laughter," Penelope said dreamily, "with the sound of running feet and voices calling to each other. We will build something that lasts, something bigger than either of us alone." By early September, the property was transformed. The house stood solid and weather-tight, with new windows that gleamed in the sunlight and a porch that no longer sagged under weight. The barn had been reinforced and expanded, ready to house horses and cattle through the coming winter. The fences marched across the property in straight, sturdy lines, defining boundaries and creating pastures. Penelope's small herd of cattle grazed contentedly, and the chickens she had purchased in Georgetown scratched in a newly built coop that was secure against predators. Harrison stood beside Penelope one afternoon, surveying their work, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. "You have done well," he said, "better than many men I have known who started with more resources and experience." "We have done well," Penelope corrected gently. "I could never have achieved this without you, Harrison. You know that." "Maybe," Harrison conceded, "but you would have found a way. You are too stubborn to fail." Penelope laughed, the sound bright and uninhibited in a way that still surprised Harrison every time he heard it. The reserved, wary woman he had met that first morning had transformed into someone confident and capable, someone who moved through her property with the assurance of ownership and competence. "I am learning to take that as a compliment," she said. That evening, Harrison made a decision that he had been contemplating for weeks, but had not had the courage to voice. They were sitting on the porch again, the familiar, comfortable silence between them, when he turned to face her fully. "Penelope," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we have not known each other long, only a few months, really, but I am 31 years old enough to know my own mind, and I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Penelope turned to look at him, her eyes wide in the gathering darkness. "Harrison." "I love you," he said simply. "I love your courage and your determination and your willingness to learn. I love how you sing while you work and how you never complain even when the job is hard. I love the way you look at this land, like it is a gift instead of a burden. I love who I am when I am with you, and I do not want to go back to being who I was before." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, hand-carved from cedar with painstaking care. Inside was a ring he had purchased in Georgetown 3 days earlier, a simple gold band with a small garnet stone. It was not elaborate or expensive, but it was honest and real, like everything else in his life. "Marry me," Harrison said. "Let me be your partner in truth, in law, and in the eyes of God. Let us build our future together, combining our properties and our lives into something neither of us could create alone." Penelope's hand flew to her mouth, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, Harrison, yes. I love you too, so much that it frightens me sometimes. I came here looking for independence, but I found something so much better. I found you." Harrison slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made specifically for her hand. They kissed with a desperate tenderness, sealing their promise to each other, and when they finally pulled apart, both were laughing and crying at once. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Georgetown, a simple ceremony attended by the few neighbors and townspeople they had come to know. Harrison wore his best suit, carefully brushed and pressed, and Penelope wore a dress of pale blue silk that she had brought from Philadelphia, one of the few luxuries she had allowed herself to keep. She carried wildflowers that Harrison had picked that morning, a bouquet of purple asters and goldenrod that perfectly captured the colors of the Montana autumn. The ceremony itself was brief, the words familiar but weighted with profound meaning. When the pastor pronounced them man and wife, Harrison kissed his bride with a joy so complete it felt almost painful, and the small congregation cheered their approval. Afterward, there was a modest reception at the boarding house, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Harrison was not normally comfortable in social situations, but with Penelope at his side, her hand warm in his, he found himself relaxing and even enjoying the celebration. They spent their wedding night at Harrison's ranch, which was in better condition and more comfortable than Penelope's property. Harrison had prepared carefully, cleaning the house more thoroughly than he had in years, putting fresh linens on the bed, and even picking more wildflowers to place in a jar on the table. Penelope stood in the doorway of his bedroom, looking both nervous and excited, and Harrison felt a wave of tenderness so strong it almost brought him to his knees. "We do not have to rush anything," he said softly, taking her hands in his. "I know this is all new and perhaps overwhelming." Penelope smiled, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. "I am not afraid," she said. "I trust you completely. I want to begin our life together in truth." They came together with a sweet, searching tenderness, learning the contours of each other's bodies and hearts with reverent attention. Harrison had known other women in his youth, brief encounters that had satisfied physical need but touched nothing deeper, and he was stunned by the difference when passion was joined with love. Penelope was inexperienced but unashamed, meeting him with a willingness and joy that made every moment precious. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, skin cooling in the night air, hearts still racing, and Harrison felt a completeness he had never imagined possible. "I love you," Penelope whispered against his chest. "I will love you for the rest of my life." "And I you," Harrison promised, kissing the top of her head, "every day for as long as I draw breath." The following month settled into a rhythm that was both challenging and deeply satisfying. They divided their time between both properties, maintaining Harrison's established ranch while continuing to develop Penelope's land. It was agreed that they would eventually combine the operations. But for now, keeping both allowed them to increase their overall herd size and provide backup in case of disaster on one property or the other. Winter came early that year, with the first snows falling in late October and the temperature dropping sharply. Harrison and Penelope worked frantically to prepare, bringing cattle closer to the barns, stockpiling hay and feed, and ensuring that all structures were secure against the coming storms. It was exhausting work, but they accomplished it together, their partnership now so seamless that they often anticipated each other's needs without speaking. The first real blizzard hit in early November, a howling monster that lasted 3 days and buried everything under feet of snow. Harrison and Penelope huddled in the ranch house, venturing out only to care for the animals, then hurrying back to the warmth of the fire. They read aloud to each other from Harrison's small collection of books, played cards, and talked about their plans for the spring. It was during this storm that Penelope first suspected she might be pregnant, though she said nothing yet, wanting to be certain before raising Harrison's hopes. By December, there was no doubt. Penelope's monthly courses had ceased, and she felt the telltale signs of early pregnancy: exhaustion, nausea in the mornings, and a strange heightened sensitivity to smells. She chose Christmas morning to tell Harrison, wrapping her news in a hand-sewn baby blanket she had been secretly working on for weeks. Harrison's hands shook as he unwrapped the small package, and when he saw what it contained, his eyes flew to Penelope's face, searching for confirmation. "Are you telling me what I think you are telling me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby," Penelope confirmed, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Sometime in late June or early July, if my calculations are correct." Harrison let out a whoop of pure joy and swept Penelope into his arms, spinning her around until she laughingly begged him to stop. "We are having a baby," he kept repeating, as though saying it aloud would make it more real. "We are going to be parents." That winter seemed both endless and too short. Harrison became almost comically protective of Penelope, insisting she rest more and work less, fretting over every minor complaint or discomfort. Penelope bore his hovering with good-natured patience, understanding that it came from love even when it was excessive. She continued to work as much as her growing body allowed, refusing to be treated as fragile, but she did accept that some tasks were now beyond her capabilities and let Harrison handle the heaviest physical labor. They spent the long winter evenings planning for the baby, discussing names and making lists of supplies they would need. Harrison built a cradle from pine wood, carving it with careful attention to detail and sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Penelope sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands moving with practiced skill, even as her belly swelled with new life. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in fits and starts, revealing the muddy earth beneath. As the weather warmed, Harrison and Penelope returned to Penelope's property, which they had decided would become their primary residence. It was smaller and more manageable than Harrison's ranch, and Penelope had an attachment to it that Harrison understood and respected. They would keep Harrison's original property as a satellite operation, using it for additional grazing and as backup shelter. In May, they received unexpected visitors. A family passing through on their way to Oregon had broken down near Georgetown, and the local pastor had directed them to Harrison and Penelope's ranch, knowing they had extra barn space and were generally willing to help travelers. The family consisted of a man, his pregnant wife, and 3 young children, all exhausted and desperate from weeks on the trail. Harrison and Penelope took them in without hesitation, providing shelter in the barn that had been converted into a comfortable guest space, along with hot food and medical care for the wife, who was struggling with her advanced pregnancy. The family stayed for 2 weeks while repairs were made to their wagon, and in that time, a friendship developed. The wife, a woman named Sarah, spent hours talking with Penelope about pregnancy and childbirth, sharing advice and encouragement that helped ease some of Penelope's anxieties. When the family finally continued their journey west, they left with full bellies, a restocked wagon, and tears of gratitude. Penelope stood beside Harrison, waving goodbye, and felt a profound sense of rightness about their decision to help. "This is what I want our life to be," she said softly. "Not just building something for ourselves, but being the kind of people who help others when they can." "Agreed," Harrison said, pulling her close. "We have been given much. It is only right to share what we can." June arrived with warm days and cool nights, and Penelope's pregnancy advanced rapidly. She was large now, moving with the careful waddle of late pregnancy, and Harrison watched her with a mixture of awe and terror. The nearest doctor was in Georgetown, a full hour's ride away, and the thought of something going wrong during childbirth kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling and praying to a God he had mostly ignored for years. On July 3rd, as the sun climbed toward noon, Penelope's water broke. She was in the garden, picking vegetables for dinner, when she felt the sudden gush of fluid and the first tightening contraction. "Harrison," she called, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "It is time." Harrison appeared as though summoned by magic, his face pale but determined. They had planned for this, had prepared as best they could, and now those preparations would be tested. He helped Penelope into the house and settled her on the bed they had prepared with clean linens and supplies. Then he rode like a man possessed toward Georgetown, praying he could reach the doctor in time. Dr. Matthews was a gruff man in his 60s who had delivered more babies than he could count, and he recognized the urgency in Harrison's face immediately. They rode back together at a pace that was probably unwise but necessary, arriving at the ranch to find Penelope in active labor, attended by a neighbor woman who had seen Harrison's distress signal. A white sheet hung in the window that they had arranged as a call for help. The labor lasted 18 hours, a brutal marathon that tested Penelope's strength to its limits and left Harrison feeling helpless and terrified. He stayed by her side throughout, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, and offering whatever comfort he could. When the baby finally emerged in the early morning hours of July 4th, the sound of its first cry was the sweetest thing Harrison had ever heard. "It is a boy," Dr. Matthews announced, holding up the squalling infant for them to see. "A healthy, strong boy." Penelope, exhausted but radiant, held out her arms for her son, and Harrison watched through tears as she cradled the baby to her chest. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." They named him Henry Marcus Kane, honoring Harrison's father and Penelope's. Little Henry was a healthy baby, with Harrison's dark hair and what promised to be Penelope's clear eyes. Harrison held his son with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the fragility and perfection of this new life they had created together. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and the steep learning curve of new parenthood. Henry was a good baby, generally content and healthy, but the sheer amount of work required to care for an infant while also maintaining a working ranch was staggering. Harrison found reserves of energy he had not known he possessed, taking over most of the physical labor so Penelope could rest and recover while caring for their son. Their small family settled into new rhythms and routines. Penelope would nurse Henry in the rocking chair Harrison had built, singing the same lullabies her mother had sung to her as a child. Harrison would hold his son while Penelope prepared meals, talking to the baby about the ranch, about the horses and cattle, about the life they were building together. It seemed impossible that they had known each other for barely more than a year, so completely had they woven their lives together. In the spring of 1885, Penelope announced she was pregnant again. Henry was not yet 2 years old, still toddling around on unsteady legs and getting into everything with the fearless curiosity of early childhood. Harrison felt a moment of panic at the thought of another baby so soon, but it was quickly overwhelmed by joy and excitement. Their daughter was born in December, a tiny, perfect creature with Penelope's honey-colored hair and a temperament that was notably more demanding than her brother's had been. They named her Lily Catherine Kane, and Henry was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to touch her and bring her his favorite toys. The ranch prospered during these years. Harrison's careful management and Penelope's business acumen proved to be a formidable combination. They gradually increased their herd, improved their breeding stock, and gained a reputation for fair dealing and quality animals. The additional property gave them flexibility and resources that many smaller ranchers lacked, and they used those advantages wisely. By 1887, with Henry approaching 4 years old and Lily a busy 2-year-old, they had achieved a stability that allowed them to think beyond simple survival. They made improvements to the house, adding rooms to accommodate their growing family and making the space more comfortable and refined. Penelope ordered furniture from a catalog, along with curtains and linens that transformed the rustic ranch house into a proper home. It was during this period of relative prosperity that tragedy struck. A late spring blizzard caught everyone by surprise, a freak storm that dumped 3 feet of snow overnight and brought temperatures that plummeted to dangerous lows. Harrison and Penelope worked frantically to save their livestock, but despite their best efforts, they lost nearly a third of their herd. The financial blow was significant, wiping out most of their cash reserves and putting them back into a precarious position. In the aftermath of the storm, sitting at their kitchen table and tallying the losses, Harrison felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. "I should have seen it coming," he said, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. "There were signs in the weather, things I should have noticed." Penelope took his hand firmly. "No one predicted this storm, Harrison. Not you, not the other ranchers, not anyone in Georgetown. We did everything we could to protect the herd. Sometimes nature simply wins and we have to accept that and move forward." "But the money," Harrison protested. "We were finally getting ahead, finally building something secure." "And we still are," Penelope insisted. "We have lost some cattle, yes, but we still have the land, the buildings, our breeding stock, and each other. We have rebuilt from worse. We will do it again." Her calm certainty steadied him, reminding Harrison of why he had fallen in love with this remarkable woman in the first place. They sat together in the quiet house, their children asleep in their beds, and made plans to rebuild. They would be more conservative with spending, more aggressive about building reserves, and more diversified in their operations so that a single disaster could never threaten their entire livelihood. Through hard work and careful management, they did recover. It took 2 years, 2 long years of sacrifice and struggle. But by 1889 they were not only back to where they had been before the storm, but actually ahead, with a larger herd and improved infrastructure. More importantly, the experience had deepened their partnership, proving that they could weather any storm together, literal or figurative. In the fall of 1889, Penelope discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. This pregnancy was more difficult than the previous 2, with severe morning sickness that lasted well into the 2nd trimester and persistent fatigue. Harrison worried constantly, but Dr. Matthews assured them that while uncomfortable, nothing suggested serious danger. Their second son was born in May of 1890, a large baby who took his time arriving, putting Penelope through another long and difficult labor. They named him William James Kane, and he proved to be a placid, easy baby who slept through the night within weeks and smiled at everyone who looked at him. The house now rang with the sound of children's voices, with Henry's serious questions and Lily's imperious demands and baby William's contented gurgles. Harrison would sometimes stand in the doorway and simply listen, marveling at the life they had built. He thought back to that morning when Penelope had ridden up to his old ranch, dusty and determined and brave, and felt profound gratitude for whatever providence had brought her to his door. As the children grew, they became increasingly involved in the work of the ranch. Henry, serious and responsible beyond his years, would follow Harrison everywhere, asking endless questions about the animals and the land and how to care for them properly. Lily had her mother's quick mind and business sense, already at age 5 keeping elaborate accounts of the chicken eggs in a little notebook Penelope had given her. William, still a toddler, was content to simply be present, observing everything with wide, curious eyes. In 1892, Georgetown celebrated its 30th anniversary as an established town, and the community organized a large celebration. Harrison and Penelope loaded their 3 children into the wagon and made the journey into town, joining their neighbors for a day of festivities. There were speeches and music, games for the children and dancing for the adults, and a sense of community that reminded them they were part of something larger than just their own small family. At the dance that evening, Harrison pulled Penelope into his arms for a waltz, their movements still synchronized after years of partnership. "Do you remember when we first met?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. "Every detail," Penelope replied. "I was so scared, so uncertain about everything. I remember thinking you were kind but wondering if I could trust your motives." "And now?" Harrison asked. "Now I know that day was the luckiest of my life," Penelope said simply. "I came to buy a horse and I found everything I had been searching for without even knowing I was searching. I found home." Harrison pulled her closer, ignoring the other dancers around them, focused entirely on the woman in his arms. "I was not even alive before you," he said. "I was just existing, going through the motions. You taught me what it means to truly live." They danced until the music ended, then collected their sleepy children and drove home under a sky brilliant with stars. The Montana night was cool and clear, perfect in the way that only a late spring evening can be, and Harrison felt a contentment so complete it was almost painful. The following years brought their share of challenges: droughts and harsh winters, fluctuating cattle prices and occasional illness, the endless hard work of maintaining a ranch and raising children. But through it all, Harrison and Penelope faced each challenge together, their partnership only growing stronger with time. In 1895, they made the significant decision to sell Harrison's original ranch property to a young couple just starting out, much as they themselves had started years before. The money from the sale allowed them to make substantial improvements to their primary property and to establish a trust fund for their children's education. Harrison felt a pang of nostalgia as he signed the papers, transferring ownership of the land he had worked so hard to claim. But Penelope's hand on his shoulder reminded him that holding on to the past was less important than building the future. Henry was 12 years old by then, already tall and strong, capable of doing a man's work when needed. Lily was 10, sharp as a tack and determined to attend the new high school that had opened in Georgetown, despite the long daily commute it would require. William was a solid, cheerful 8-year-old who loved the animals with a passion that suggested he would never want to do anything but ranch for the rest of his life. On a golden afternoon in September of 1896, Harrison and Penelope stood together on the rise overlooking their property, watching their children play in the yard below. 13 years had passed since that morning when Penelope had ridden up to his door, looking for a horse and finding so much more. They were in their 40s now, no longer young, marked by years of hard work and mountain weather, but still strong, still capable, still deeply in love. "Do you have any regrets?" Harrison asked, the question coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Penelope was quiet for a long moment, considering. "None," she said finally. "Not one single moment. This life has been everything I hoped for and more than I dared dream. Hard, yes, but rich and full and meaningful." "I sold you a horse," Harrison said, a smile playing at his lips. "Best sale I ever made." "And gave your heart for free," Penelope added softly. "Though I think I am the one who got the better bargain in that transaction." Harrison pulled her into his arms, kissing her with the same tenderness and passion he had felt on their first kiss all those years ago. "No," he said when they finally pulled apart. "We both won. That is the secret, I think. In the best partnerships, both people win." As they walked back down the rise toward their home, toward their children and the life they had built together, Harrison felt a profound sense of completion. He had started with nothing but determination and land, had worked for years in lonely isolation, building something solid but somehow hollow. Then Penelope had arrived, needing a horse and willing to accept help, and everything had changed. She had come to buy a horse from a rancher in Montana Territory in the summer of 1883. And in the transaction, they had both discovered that the most valuable things in life cannot be bought or sold. Love, partnership, family, belonging, these were gifts freely given and freely received, treasures beyond price that grew richer with each passing year. Their story was not one of grand adventures or dramatic rescues, but rather the quieter, deeper tale of two people who had found each other across the vastness of the frontier and chosen to build something lasting. It was a story written in hard work and tender moments, in children's laughter and shared struggles, in morning coffee and evening dances, in the steady accumulation of days that became years that became a lifetime. The Montana sky stretched endless above them, the same sky that had witnessed their first meeting and would witness all their days to come. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, a reminder that some things endure. And between the earth and sky, on a piece of land made precious by the labor and love poured into it, Harrison and Penelope Kane walked hand in hand toward home, their children running ahead, their future stretching bright before them. Years continued to pass, each one adding its own chapters to their shared story. By 1900, as a new century dawned, Henry was preparing to leave for college in the East, determined to study veterinary medicine so he could return and bring modern animal care practices to Montana ranchers. The decision filled Harrison with pride and a bittersweet sadness, the universal parental mixture of emotions when a child prepares to leave home. Lily had become indispensable to the ranch operations, managing their accounts with a precision that would have impressed any professional bookkeeper. She had no interest in leaving Montana, declaring that everything she wanted was right there on the ranch. At 15, she was already fielding inquiries from several young men in the area, much to Harrison's consternation and Penelope's amusement. William, at 13, had grown into a quiet, steady presence, with an almost supernatural ability to understand and connect with animals. Harrison often said that William could speak horse and cattle better than he spoke English, and it was true that the boy seemed to communicate with their livestock on a level that transcended normal training and handling. In the spring of 1901, Penelope surprised Harrison with news that left him speechless. "I am pregnant again," she said, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I know we thought we were finished having children, but it seems life had other plans." Harrison's first reaction was concern. Penelope was 43 years old now, and while still strong and healthy, having a baby at her age carried risks that neither of them could ignore. But beneath the worry was joy, the knowledge that they would have another child to love and raise together. Their fourth child, a daughter they named Rose Ellen Kane, was born in November of 1901, as the first snows of winter began to fall. The labor was surprisingly quick and uncomplicated, and Rose emerged into the world with a lusty cry that suggested she had no intention of being overlooked simply because she was the youngest. Henry was home from college for the holidays when his baby sister was born, and the sight of his tall, educated son cradling the tiny infant with such tenderness brought tears to Harrison's eyes. The early years of the new century brought changes to Montana and to their lives. The railroad expanded, bringing more settlers and making it easier to transport cattle to eastern markets. Georgetown grew from a rough frontier town into a proper community with schools, churches, shops, and even a small hospital. The wild days of the frontier were fading into memory, replaced by a more settled, civilized existence. Harrison and Penelope adapted to these changes as they had adapted to everything else, taking what was useful and maintaining what was important to them. They upgraded their ranch operations with some modern conveniences while preserving the core values and practices that had served them well. They installed a telephone line in 1903, which seemed like magic to Harrison, but which Lily immediately mastered and used to expand their business dealings. Henry graduated from veterinary school in 1905 and returned home, immediately putting his education to work improving the health and productivity of their herd. He brought with him a bride, a sensible young woman named Anna from Ohio, who took to ranch life with an adaptability that reminded Harrison of Penelope. They built a house on the property, close enough to be part of the family operation but far enough to have their own privacy and independence. Lily shocked everyone by announcing at age 21 that she was not interested in marriage, but wanted instead to start her own business. Using money she had saved and invested with remarkable savvy, she opened a feed and supply store in Georgetown, catering specifically to the needs of ranchers and farmers. It was an instant success, and within 2 years she had expanded to include a second location in a neighboring town. William, true to his childhood passion, took over more and more of the day-to-day ranch operations as Harrison began to slow down. Harrison was in his 50s now, still strong but feeling the accumulated wear of decades of physical labor. He was more than happy to turn over the hardest work to his son, who managed the cattle and horses with the same intuitive understanding he had shown as a boy. Rose, growing up surrounded by older siblings and parents who were older than most, developed a precocious intelligence and independence. She learned to ride almost before she could walk, and by age 5 she was following William around the ranch, absorbing everything he taught her about animal care and land management. On a summer evening in 1908, 25 years after they had first met, Harrison and Penelope sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Rose was playing in the yard with a litter of puppies, her laughter bright and pure. In the distance, they could see lights in Henry and Anna's house, where their first grandchild, a boy named James, was being put to bed. Lily was in town, closing up her store for the day. William was in the barn, checking on a mare that was due to foal any day. 25 years, Penelope said softly, echoing Harrison's thoughts. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like only yesterday that I rode up to your ranch, terrified and trying not to show it. You were the bravest person I had ever met, Harrison said. You still are. Coming west alone, buying property sight unseen, determined to build a life on your own terms. I fell in love with you that first morning, I think, though I did not recognize it immediately. And I with you, Penelope admitted. When you offered to sell me Scout for half price and help me with repairs, I thought you must want something from me. It took me time to understand that you simply wanted to help, that kindness could be genuine and without ulterior motive. You taught me to trust again, Harrison. You gave me back something my brother's household had taken from me. Harrison reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining automatically after years of such gestures. We built something good here, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just the ranch, though that is part of it. But a family, a legacy, something that will outlast us both. Our great-grandchildren will probably work this land someday, Penelope mused. They will walk where we walked, tend animals descended from the ones we raised, and maybe, if we are very lucky, they will understand what this place meant to us. As if summoned by their words, Rose came running up to the porch, a squirming puppy in her arms. Mama, Papa, look how sweet he is. Can I keep him, please? Harrison and Penelope exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them in the way of long married couples. What would you name him? Harrison asked. Scout, Rose said immediately. After the first horse Papa sold you, Mama, the one you told me about. Penelope's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled her daughter into a hug, puppy and all. Then of course you may keep him, she said. Scout is a fine name full of history and meaning. That night, lying in bed with Penelope curled against his side, Harrison thought about the intricate web of consequences that had led to this moment. If Penelope had not lost her father, she would never have come west. If she had chosen a different property, or if the Georgetown solicitor had recommended a different rancher for horses, their paths might never have crossed. If Harrison had been less generous or Penelope less willing to accept help, they might have remained forever strangers. But instead, they had found each other. Two people who fit together so perfectly it seemed like destiny, though Harrison knew it was really a choice they had made and continued to make every day. The choice to be kind, to be open, to be vulnerable, to trust and to love even when it would have been easier to remain closed and solitary. As Penelope's breathing deepened into sleep, Harrison made a silent promise to the universe, to his children and grandchildren yet unborn, to the land itself. He promised to remain worthy of the gifts he had been given, to honor the trust Penelope had placed in him all those years ago, to steward this land and this family with all the wisdom and love he possessed. The years rolled on, bringing their mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. Harrison's health began to decline in his early 60s, a lifetime of hard physical labor taking its inevitable toll. He developed arthritis in his hands and knees, making it difficult to perform many of the tasks that had once been second nature. It was a humbling experience, learning to accept help from his children, relinquishing control of operations he had managed for decades. But Penelope was there through it all, as she had always been, adapting to his changing needs with the same grace and determination she had brought to every other challenge in their lives. She helped him with buttons he could no longer fasten on painful mornings, brought him coffee in bed when his knees would not cooperate, and sat with him on the porch when he needed to rest, talking about everything and nothing as they had done for 30 years. In 1915, Henry and Anna had their third child, a daughter who reminded everyone strongly of Penelope. Lily, against all expectations, finally married at age 31, choosing a widowed banker from town who appreciated her independence and business acumen. William married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, effectively doubling their land holdings and creating an operation large enough to sustain multiple families. Rose, at age 14, announced her intention to become a teacher, inspired by the education Penelope had fought so hard to give all their children. She wanted to help other children, especially girls, to access learning opportunities that would give them choices in life, just as her mother had been given choices by her own father's progressive attitudes. On a crystal-clear morning in September of 1918, Harrison woke before dawn as was his lifelong habit, despite no longer having the physical ability to perform morning chores. He lay in bed, listening to Penelope breathe beside him, and felt a profound sense of peace. He was 66 years old, weathered and worn but deeply content. Every ache in his body was earned, every limitation a testament to years of honest work and good living. Penelope stirred beside him, her hand seeking his automatically even in sleep. Harrison laced his fingers through hers and watched the dawn light gradually fill their bedroom, illuminating the face of the woman he had loved for 35 years. There was gray in her honey-colored hair now, lines around her eyes and mouth. But to Harrison she was as beautiful as she had been that first morning when she had ridden up to his ranch, dusty and determined and brave. They had built something extraordinary together, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through the accumulation of 1,000 small choices made in love and trust. Every morning they chose each other, every challenge they faced together, every joy they shared doubled, and every sorrow halved simply by being in partnership. As Penelope's eyes opened and found his, as her lips curved in the familiar smile that still made his heart skip a beat, Harrison felt a gratitude so profound it was almost prayer. He had been a lonely rancher, isolated by choice and circumstance, going through the motions of living without truly being alive. Then one summer morning in 1883, a woman had ridden up to buy a horse, and everything had changed. She had bought the horse, Scout, who had served her faithfully for many years. But Harrison had given her something far more valuable, his heart, freely offered without expectation of return. And in one of life's great miracles, she had treasured that gift, had protected and nurtured it, and had given her own heart in return. "Good morning, my love," Penelope whispered, her voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning," Harrison replied, pulling her close. "Every morning with you is good." Outside, the ranch was waking up. They could hear William calling to the ranch hands, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the bark of dogs and the whinny of horses. Their empire, built from nothing but determination and love, continued its eternal rhythms with or without their direct involvement. That was as it should be. They had done their part, had laid a foundation that would support generations to come. Their story was not yet finished, though Harrison could feel in his bones that he had more past than future now. But whatever time remained, whether years or months or days, he would spend it as he had spent the last 35 years. Beside Penelope, grateful for every moment, secure in a love that had proved strong enough to weather every storm and sweet enough to make even the hardest days precious. The years continued, each one adding its own grace notes to their symphony. Harrison's health stabilized, neither improving nor significantly worsening, and he settled into a gentler rhythm of life. He spent his days consulting with William on ranch decisions, playing with his growing number of grandchildren, and sitting on the porch with Penelope, watching the Montana sky paint itself in endless variations of beauty. Rose graduated from Teachers College in 1923 and took a position at the Georgetown School, quickly becoming known as a demanding but beloved educator who had high expectations for all her students, especially girls. She remained unmarried, declaring that she had a different kind of calling, and Harrison and Penelope supported her choice without reservation, proud of the independent, purposeful woman she had become. In the summer of 1926, as they approached their 43rd anniversary, Penelope and Harrison hosted a massive family gathering at the ranch. All their children came, along with their spouses and children, a tribe of Kanes that numbered nearly 20 people. They roasted a whole steer, made vast quantities of food, and spent 3 days celebrating the legacy they had built together. On the final evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Harrison stood to make a toast. At 74, he was frail and moved slowly, but his mind remained sharp and his voice, though weakened, still carried. "I want to tell you all a story," he began, his eyes finding Penelope in the crowd. 43 years ago, a brave young woman rode up to my ranch to buy a horse. She was starting over, building a new life in a hard land, and she needed help, though it cost her pride to ask for it. Everyone grew quiet, even the youngest children sensing the importance of the moment. I sold her that horse, a gelding named Scout, for half of what he was worth. But I also gave her something else that day, though neither of us quite realized it at the time. I gave her my heart, freely and completely, without expectation of return. It was the best decision I ever made." Penelope's eyes were bright with tears as Harrison continued. "That woman taught me what it means to truly live, what it means to build something that lasts, what it means to give everything you have to another person and trust that they will honor that gift. She took a lonely, isolated rancher and made him part of something bigger and better than himself. She gave me all of you." He gestured to the assembled family, his voice breaking slightly. "Our children, our grandchildren, this ranch that supports us all, this legacy that will hopefully continue for generations. None of this would exist if not for her courage, her determination, her willingness to accept help and to give love in return." Harrison raised his glass, and everyone rose to join him. "To Penelope Morrison Kane, the woman who came to buy a horse and instead built an empire of love. May we all be half as brave, half as wise, and half as generous as she has been." The toast was drunk with tears and laughter, and then everyone was embracing, celebrating not just the anniversary but the entire improbable, wonderful story that had brought them all into existence. Penelope made her way to Harrison's side, and they held each other as their family swirled around them, a living testament to the power of love and partnership. "You are such a sentimental old man," Penelope whispered against Harrison's chest, but her voice was warm with affection. "Only about you," Harrison replied. "Only ever about you." They stood together under the vast Montana sky, surrounded by the family they had created and the land they had tamed together, and felt the profound satisfaction of a story well told, a life well lived, a love that had transformed everything it touched. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and Harrison and Penelope moved into their twilight years with grace and dignity. They celebrated their 45th anniversary in 1928, then their 50th in 1933, a milestone that brought family from across the country to honor the enduring love that had been the foundation of so many lives. Harrison passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1934, at the age of 82. He simply did not wake one morning, still holding Penelope's hand as he had held it for 51 years. His death, while sad, felt appropriate somehow, a gentle ending to a life lived fully and well. He was buried on a rise overlooking the ranch with a simple headstone that read, Harrison Marcus Kane, 1852–1934. Beloved husband, father, and grandfather, he lived with honor and loved without reservation. Penelope grieved, as was natural after losing her partner of more than half a century, but she did not diminish. Instead, she gathered her family around her and continued to live with purpose and engagement. She remained at the ranch, now managed primarily by William and his children, offering advice when asked but mostly content to watch the next generation take the reins she and Harrison had held for so long. She lived another 10 years, dying peacefully at age 86 in 1944, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who had gathered to say goodbye. Her last words, whispered to Rose who was holding her hand, were simple. Tell them I came to buy a horse, and I received a life beyond my wildest dreams. Tell them love is always worth the risk. She was buried beside Harrison, their headstones side by side as they had been side by side in life. Her stone read, Penelope Morrison Kane, 1858–1944. Beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, she lived with courage and loved without fear. The ranch continued, as they had always intended, passing through the generations with the same core values of hard work, fair dealing, and family that Harrison and Penelope had established. Their great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren would eventually work the land, many of them never knowing the full story of the brave woman who had ridden up to a lonely rancher's door one summer morning in 1883, needing a horse and finding so much more. But in the family, the story was told and retold, a founding myth that shaped how each generation understood themselves and their place in the world. They learned that courage means taking risks even when you are afraid, that love requires vulnerability and trust, that building something lasting demands both independence and partnership, that the best gifts are often those given freely, without expectation of return. And sometimes, on clear Montana evenings when the sky blazes with sunset colors and the mountains stand eternal against the horizon, those who work the land that Harrison and Penelope carved from wilderness like to imagine they can feel the presence of those two remarkable people, still together, still building, still loving after all these years. The story of She Came to Buy a Horse had become legend in the family, but it was never just legend. It was truth, solid and real as the land itself, a testament to what two people can build when they choose love over fear, partnership over isolation, and courage over safety. It was a story that began with a simple transaction and became something transcendent, proving that sometimes the most valuable things in life cannot be bought or sold, only given freely from one heart to another. And in the giving, both hearts had been transformed, made richer and fuller and more complete. The rancher had sold a horse and given his heart for free, but in return he had received a gift beyond price, a love that had sustained him for 51 years, and a legacy that would endure for generations. It was, by any measure, the best deal he had ever made.